Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is, I think, it's going to be a very interesting discussion. And the problem that we're going to discuss is large. I wish the solutions were as evident as the problems are significant. But we are going to try to make some progress toward figuring out how to address this dangerous and growing threat, given the emergence of social media as a vehicle for the kinds of issues we'll be discussing here. We've got a great panel to talk about these issues. And let me just do a brief introduction. I'm not going to spend much time here. Just to my left is Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy. I hope I pronounced it vaguely right. Whatever. You'll tell us. Okay. Who is, among other things, she is, tell me if this is right, the only woman director to have received 2 Academy Awards by age 37. Correct. You know, like, what did you do during that time? So, next to Sharmeen is Matthew Caruana Galizia, who is a longtime investigative journalist himself, principally with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, where he worked on things like the Pentagon Papers and the Luxembourg leaks. But as he will tell us, he also had a personal tragedy, very much related to the work of investigative journalism, which we'll get to in a moment. Next is Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who remarkably invented the World Wide Web. You know, there was a moment when there was not a www, but who since then has been, for the purposes here, very much at the forefront of trying to develop an ethics around these kinds of issues. And can we better enforce standards of some sort with respect to internet governance to address the kind of issues that we'll be discussing today? And finally, Patrick Chappatte, my favorite political cartoonist, who, if you don't know his work, you should please look it up. There is, some of it is featured in an exhibit here. But Patrick does political cartoons in English in the New York Times, in French, in Le Temps, in German, in New Zürcher Zeitung, and Der Spiegel. But is also, for these purposes, one of the founders of Cartooning for Peace, which tries to highlight the plight of political cartoonists who face persecution and makes Patrick particularly valuable to our conversation today. So I'm going to start with Sharmeen, because I think Sharmeen has had the most experience with the sort of threats and harassment that can attend being a public figure today. Sharmeen, could you just briefly tell us a little bit about what you've encountered?
I make a lot of men very angry because the kind of work that I do highlights misogyny, highlights patriarchy, and goes up against the old guard and the system. And you know, women get it particularly bad online. It's not simply, we're not simply attacked for the work that we do, but also for the way we look, for the way we dress, for countless things. I have been on the receiving end of, you know, death threats and the normal things that women who speak out are. But more than that, I chose to speak out about sexual harassment 2 years ago. And I had to take myself off Twitter after that, because the kind of hate that came my way included videos of men doing all kinds of things to my photograph, articles written about me, just absolutely despicable stuff. And you think for a moment that the work that you do, and then you see all of this happening, and it does take a personal toll on you. And so I went offline, and I still am not on Twitter, and there's almost all of my social media is controlled by someone else and not myself, because that's just one way of me protecting myself.
Okay. Matthew, could you talk a bit about your mother's situation and what can happen with this?
I mean, before the discussion started, we were just talking between us, and I was saying just this, that for women, it's a whole lot worse. I mean, to kind of a level, a degree that no man would be able to understand. I experienced this through my mother. She was a journalist for 30 years, long before the web was invented. And I mean, she was targeted via her children. So, I mean, people who didn't like what she was writing. I mean, Malta's a highly misogynistic society. It's very politically polarized. So my mother would be attacked for the same sort of thing, for calling out misogyny, for calling out patriarchal ideas, and her sort of opponents would go after her through me and my brothers. And this, of course, deeply affects a mother. Because nothing was done about this, there was impunity for all of this harassment. It just got worse and worse. I mean, things like anonymous letters or anonymous emails then led to physical attacks. Our house was set on fire twice. Our dogs were killed. And then eventually my mother was murdered. It just, because there was impunity for all of this harassment. And the people who carried out the murder, I mean, expected reasonably that they would also enjoy impunity for the murder, considering that no one had been brought to justice for anything else leading up to that.
And your mother was investigating corruption.
Yeah, she was investigating corruption.
Yeah. Now, I mean, corruption, I think we find, is often a reason why investigators are attacked. And Patrick, I wonder if you could address that through the lens of some of your cartoonist colleagues who, have mocked corrupt and autocratic rulers.
Yeah, sure, because indeed, editorial cartoons are very emblematic. They're a kind of concentrate of all those issues of freedom of speech. This speaks to the power of images, I guess, to the fact that we could talk about the Danish cartoons controversy. That's a big one. Maybe we will allude to that. And 10 years after that, we came to, it was like a continuation of that drama. We arrived to the point where cartoonists were killed in Paris in the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And I was rushed in Davos and put in I don't know how many panels. It was a terrible moment where the most extreme form of censorship was exercised, which is killing. People were killed because they had just drawn cartoons. And the thing that I kept on repeating right after the killing is we now live in an open world with closed minds. And I think that is kind of the debate we're going to have. What do we do with that? Speaking about cartoonists, so you have three forms of threat, at least, if not more. You have cartoonists are facing the radicalization of some groups. In many places, in a lot of places, in a majority of places, they are facing the repression of the government. So you can, there's an exhibition on the promenade. You can see some of the cartoons. There is the case of Zunar, the cartoonist from Malaysia, who was prosecuted under 9 counts of the Sedition Act, and he risked 43 years in jail. But all the charges were dropped by miracle when there was a general election last spring in Malaysia, and the new government arrived. So he got off the hook, which is not the case of, for example, Turkish cartoonist Muzakart, working for the opposition, pretty much the only opposition newspaper, Cumhuriyet. He was swept up after the attempted coup on Erdogan in 2016, and he has been sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in jail for being a cartoonist in Turkey, so close to Europe.
All right, so this is the problem, and I don't think anybody doubted that there's a problem, but you have violence, including murder, you have detention, and you have online threats and harassment. So that's our beginning, that's our foundation. What I really want to devote most of today to is what do we do about this? And Tim, I want to turn to you because you've been involved in these kind of discussions, and focusing in particular on the way in which social media or electronic communications contribute to this. What are some of the ways in which we're beginning to look at addressing it and regulating the problem?
Well, I start with, I'm not here as the person on the panel with the answers. Okay, I'm a person on the panel with the questions. To a certain extent, the Web Foundation has its contract for the web, which you can look up online, webfoundation.org/for-the-web, and you will find there that we have got a bunch of people who have signed up to support it, and you can join that. And among it, it tries to be generally across the web, what do we need to sort out what's going wrong? And this is one of the things. There are other things. There are other things that only half the people on the planet are actually online. So there are lots of things to do. Some of those things, it's easy to we can all gang together and say, yeah, more people online. it's more bandwidth, cheaper. That's those are things where everybody can agree. Then there are some things like anonymity, questions of anonymity, and the rights of whistleblowers versus and basically hate speech versus free speech debates, where there is no. You can't just wave a banner in one direction, and it's much more complicated. And where at the end of the day, you end up with conflicting rights. The right to be a whistleblower and be anonymous conflicts with my right, if you insult me, if you harass me, to know who you are. And in a way, both of those are reasonable rights. And so in these cases where society has to come together, and it used to do it locally, in the local school or in the local town, people would, in the local community, people would have come to an agreement. Or in a club, people, in a golf club, people would come to agreement about what you can wear and what you can, what words are allowed, and they can, in the club, you can do that to a certain extent. You can do that however you like, because other people don't have to join the club. And to a certain extent, when some of the social networks started online, you could argue that, well, Facebook is a club, and so the CEO of Facebook can make the rules, and because other people can join, you can join other clubs. Now, I'm not going to. You can argue, actually, no, it's too much of the world. It's more like become an international government, but still, when you talk about who should end up making the decision, still it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't take away from you the problem that at the end of the day you have to make really hard decisions. I think looking back through history, we found this has swung dramatically from one way to the other, and that's huge. Typically what happens is there's a horrible infringement of free speech rights. Journalists are locked up for speaking, and so free speech advocates become stronger, and then somebody uses their right of free speech to do something really horrible and incite a genocide, and then it swings back the other way. So I think there's no magic bullet. There's no magic answer.
Okay.
Sure. I think, but one thing I will pick up on though, which is interesting, is stepping back. What about this world in which we are sitting right now? What on earth this polarized the fact. Certainly, some of the countries I know, the politics is basically dysfunctional and in free fall, and a lot of that is because of the polarization. And the polarization is the online is seen for many as a word where they exercise their need to be really nasty online, and where people are very polarized. So the polarization. So one of the questions, of indirect question, is we can't immediately solve these problems, but one of the things we should also really look at is to what extent we can build online systems where the software itself and the way people are prompted and the way the workflow path you can go through the system and what happens when you retweet, when you like things. How can you? What's interesting is, does that sort of design, does the engineering design of those systems actually have an effect on the polarization? And if so, is it possible for us to start tweaking the platforms? So that's one of the things I have been asking about. If the platforms start gently, bit by bit, introducing you to people that are like the people you always, like the friends of a friend, but slightly different, can they bit by bit start to turn this horrible polarization, start to dilute it, start to introduce it to people that are different, tackle the polarization, which in a way may be the sort of cause behind the horrible level of incidence of all this horribleness.
All right. Well, Tim, you brought up a lot of questions, and beginning toward the solutions, I want to take a step backwards. Sharmeen, you mentioned Twitter, but I'd like to focus on Facebook, because you have been a victim of Facebook harassment and threats and the like. And social media is a wonderful thing in many respects. It gives all of us the opportunity to be heard. We don't have to go through a traditional media outlet to have that happen, but it also means anybody can respond and sometimes violently, sometimes with harassment. So could you just talk a bit about how you've experienced social media?
Listen, I have very radical ideas about social media because I think that we have unleashed a beast that we have no control over. And I think that being anonymous online should not be an option at all, because the amount of rumors that are spread, the amount of videos that go on, people are being killed every single day in countries around the world. And who is responsible for that? It's social media. Rumors are spreading. Activists are being targeted. People are being shot. And no one is taking responsibility of it. I mean, tomorrow, if a video goes viral about me, a video has gone viral about me last year that could have gotten me killed. And it took me literally having to beg a CEO of a company to pull it down. I mean, this is not what should be happening at all. I strongly believe that, when you have this beast, you need to have some sort of identity online that can be verified so that if something goes wrong, you put something out there, some country, some people can go after you. I mean, right now, my biggest thing is that we're not keeping the people who need to be kept safe, because activists are being targeted, political opponents are being targeted, all of these things are happening, and it happens at such a rapid pace that no one knows where it started and who started it.
I mean, let me explore this idea of abolishing anonymity. I mean, clearly people behave better when they have an identity. Would we want to go all that way? I don't know. I mean, Matthew, you may have experience just in terms of, confidential sources. I think about a place like China, where if you're going to have political opinions expressed that are contrary to the government, you need anonymity. It may be different in Pakistan, but where would you come out on that?
I think that the potential for abuse is too great. Mm-hmm. It's very clear for me that I simply would not want to live in a world where anything you do online is attached to your real world identity. The risk is too high. I understand the evil things that people do because they're enabled by anonymity. But I also understand that we need anonymity in order to fight evil. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is sort of more important. I mean, speaking as someone who has experienced both. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've relied on anonymous sources in my work. Mm-hmm. And also I've experienced attacks from people who abuse of their anonymity. Mm-hmm. And there are anonymous communities that are built on anonymity online that are perfectly civilized. Mm-hmm. I mean, communities of independent artists, musicians, writers, and so on. It's not, we shouldn't take it for granted that anonymity leads to this kind of toxic community. Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a trade-off. I mean, people misbehave, but it's also necessary for whistleblowers and the like. Let me ask you, so we're sort of right now assuming speech that clearly we would want to suppress, threats, violence, bullying, harassment. But how would you define the kind of speech that should be prohibited when we get into sort of tougher areas? Hate speech, for example, speech that is, not inciting violence directly, but maybe demonizing some minority. Where any of the panelists, I mean, where would you try to start drawing that line?
First, as a cartoonist, of course, you will expect me to say, and I think that speech can't be policed and shouldn't be. Now, and I will always defend the right of a fellow cartoonist to do a cartoon of very bad taste that I just don't like, and wouldn't defend the cartoon, it's not because I don't need to appreciate something to defend the freedom to do it, and to be of bad taste, and to, in the process, it might hurt some people. But that's, so speech shouldn't be policed, but maybe that's the discussion we just had. Maybe platforms, internet platforms should be and can be, but how? And that's the big point. There used to be a space of mediation and curation that was called the media. I'm speaking for my church now. That space was crushed by internet platforms and by social media. And I don't know how journalism became such a bad word now in this world. It's on top of that under attack, even in democracies, and for many reasons. You can have many reproach. against the media. But still, we need to bring, I guess, maybe that would be a solution, bring mediation and curation back into the internet platforms. So how do you do that? Is it the platforms themselves? Will they do it? They have moderators, but that's not what I'm talking about. You have the government. Can you trust the government? Maybe there could be a system of certification responding to some good practice and norms. And that system would be willingly approved by the platforms. They would apply it willingly. And then we would start to expand a space of curation and curation of speech. Because the point is social media has leveled everything, so everybody pretty much has a voice, which is a good thing, but not everybody. That doesn't make everybody a journalist. And the journalistic rules, the media rules, which is to check your facts, to double check your facts, to verify your sources, and then to curate content. That's something we need to bring back in the system, maybe through those certification policies.
When Facebook started, you needed to have an email address that was associated to a college or university initially to sign up. We have to enable some sort of culture for there to be a linkage back to the person who has signed up. Maybe, yes, platforms would be a great way to do that. Anyone can upload anything online right now, and there's no, and they're free to do so without having any consequences. So for me, the way I look at this issue is that you need to have some sort of certification done on something that when you put something online, you can get traced back. When you talk about sources, for example, and I have sources all the time for as a documentary filmmaker, people coming up to us, but a lot of people email us, you know, and that anonymously email. But putting a video online or hate speech online is slightly different.
So I can tell one story about anonymity from the World Wide Web Consortium, which is a standards body. So if you like, it's a club, it's a group of people who get together and agree on technical standards. And the rule is that in general, is that you declare all of the companies that you're associated with, so that when people can understand whose favorite designs you might be trying to put into the standard. And then when somebody came along one day and said, I'd like to participate with my online ID. I don't want to participate with my actual real ID. I feel I've been doing this, in fact, on the mailing list for a long time. People know me by my nickname. That's where my reputation is. So I have a reputation to defend there. So I can be a professional person, but I'd rather not be tied to my to my real identity. So so the management of the consortium sat about it and thought, okay, that seems a reasonable request. So we ended up with a compromise where we decided, okay, we will announce to everybody in the group that this person will not is not disclosing any of their relationships and affiliations or identity, and will operate under a pseudonym. However, we have staff who know exactly who they are and where they live and what their affiliations are, and can say that they don't seem to have any crazy conflict of interests. And so we respect the right to operate as an independent pseudo person, as opposed to as a persona, as opposed to a person. But we will hold them to a very high degree of good behaviour online, and we will, and in the event that anybody complains that they have abused their anonymity, then we will construct some process. We don't have a process, but we will construct one on the spot, which will have in which the complaint can be heard and which there can be due appeal against it, and which necessarily, possibly, will take it outside the consortium. Possibly, we would then construct some appeal to the actual judicial system, and possibly to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, where we happen to be sitting, because we feel that this is that while that anonymity is important, and it's important tool and it's valuable in this case, but we would regard it as a privilege, and a privilege that could be withdrawn. So that's what we decided to do.
Tim, that's a very elaborate procedure, but we're dealing with platforms
with a very small number
that have gazillions of users every single day. So let me just ask, because I'd like to get past the anonymity question.
You have to also assume that in many cases the authority is hostile. I mean, you're assuming a situation where there's this kind of benevolent authority. I mean, in countries like my own or India, Turkey, I mean, even if the accounts of the people perpetrating this abuse are linked to their real-world IDs, what is the state going to do about it when you yourself, as the victim, are the enemy of that state? They're going to do absolutely nothing about it.
Yes, you get a completely different design when you don't have a benevolent,
you don't have a global platform.
An authority you can trust.
Yeah, these are global platforms. So, but I guess if you can't trust the government, why do we want to trust Mark Zuckerberg? Who is Mark Zuckerberg?
It's your decision at the end of the day to participate in that community or not. I mean, if you want to trust him, fine, participate. If you don't.
Well, except that Facebook has become, in many ways, a utility. I mean, if you want to engage in social media, there are limited options. There's Facebook, there's Instagram, which they own. There's WhatsApp, which they own, or there's Twitter. So there are limited options. But let's put. I mean, given that they are who they are, what responsibilities do they have? How should they structure themselves to fairly govern these kinds of questions? Any of you?
Yeah, again, they got away with it because until now they have not accepted their responsibility and their role, which is basically the role of a media. And they're not being, they don't want to recognize themselves as a media. And this is why at some point we need to, anyway, they're facing regulation and they know it. It's going to change. I mean, the situation is going to change. They want it or not. So that's why I'm thinking of a third body, an international body that would find, good practice that they can agree on, but they would more or less willingly accept those responsibilities, and they will start hiring ethicists and journalists instead of just hiring social behaviorists and bankers and lawyers.
I mean, listen,
we were supposed to be friends on Facebook. Remember that? It was a long time ago.
I don't think that any of us can have an answer, because in all of our countries, media, television or radio, all of that is governed by some authority, right? You put something on air, they don't like it, they can pull it down. You say something, it's some version of some authority exists in every country. And I think with Facebook, it's a country in itself. I mean, they on an emergency footing, they need to do 1,000 things to ensure that people are safe. But do they even have, are they moving towards that? In a way they are, because they are putting more content providers who are filtering through content. But to go through millions of things literally every minute, I don't think anyone's ever done that. There's no precedent for that.
So if you were in charge of Facebook, what would you do?
Oh, I'm very radical. I would make sure that everyone's ID would be real.
No, but beyond that, in other words, but even if they have real ID, you're going to get misbehavior. So what is, and I think you're right. First of all, there's artificial intelligence that reviews most things. When there are close calls, they have people who increasingly know the language and the culture. They didn't have that 2 years ago, but they're moving in that direction. So you're getting some cultural sensitivity to what is unduly provocative speech or not. But let's say there are difficult questions. Then what do? Should Mark Zuckerberg make those decisions? Should a government that we don't necessarily trust make those decisions? Should we be looking to bring in outside experts? I mean, what would be the right governance structure for Facebook, given its responsibilities as such an important platform toward the world?
Well, what's the right structure for the world? I mean, the UN being a body, like when there are disputes that take place, I mean, are we doing it? Are countries doing it? Is the UN deciding? I don't think that there's one particular answer to something like this. I mean, obviously, a body, but who gives that body power? Will every country sign up to it? Will they take responsibility if someone spreads hate speech on it? Are they going to, are there going to be laws that they're going to apply? Is there going to be a charter that everyone's going to sign? All countries around the world?
Well, we also have the Chinese model, which is, very constrained. So I ran through the Western social media platforms, but in fact, they're Chinese variations that are super constrained. So we already, we have some variation. Do we want to let the UN decide where China has such a large voice, or do we allow, national governments to make these decisions, recognizing there'll be variations, but you can't always trust these national governments either, as Matthew points out.
To decide on what? On what to prosecute as hate speech,
or
what to block, or
what the standard is in the tough cases.
Okay.
Do you prosecute the Danish cartoonists, or do you prosecute the people who commit violence in the name? I mean, they're difficult questions that come up all the time.
Okay, but even before we get to the very difficult, isolated questions, the whole practice, the whole business model of those companies is the problem. And they will be forced at some point to change something, because they are stirring up conflict by the very design of their system. I think, 70% of the views on YouTube are generated by recommendations. And it's the most extreme content that drives those numbers. So there is a technology. You can tell it better than me. The algorithms that are behind all that can be tweaked in a different way. Once you have content once you adhere to good principles, to some principles at least, and want to act in a positive way and have content that is certified, well, you can with the algorithms push that content much more than all the the extreme content that they're pushing right now.
Tim, you alluded to this. The algorithms right now prioritize engagement because engagement is profitable. But some engagement is fine. You could have positive messages that engage a lot of people. Some is divisive. Who should decide which engagement to promote and which not?
It's a really difficult question, because we can't fall into the trap of assuming that strong emotion is bad. There are some instances where it's necessary for people to be angry. Yesterday I was on a panel with the president of Serbia, Vučić, and he kept going on about how bad negative emotion is online. Well, of course people are going to react negatively to you. They accuse you of corruption, and you're hated by more than half your population. Obviously, he's going to complain about that. Right. So, I mean, anywhere where there are dictators, where there's a repressive regime, people are going to be angry, and they're going to want to express that. So, I don't think we should promote flat emotions over ones that are stronger. Or assume that any angry emotion is bad, or that violent content is bad. Sometimes people need to see violent content in order to realize that something is really wrong. Otherwise, they're never going to realize. I mean,
outrage is useful.
But sometimes, though, the way the system has been designed, it brings out bad things, like the case of the kids in Macedonia, in Venice, Macedonia, when who were during the Trump campaign, they ended up they had websites, they made money out of websites, and what they think up a headline and they tweet the headline. The headline would point to the websites. Websites had all kind of interlocking content, which where they would get ad revenue. And then, as long as people stayed on their websites for a bit, it would pay the rent. And they were living in a town where there wasn't a lot of other stuff to do. So, and in fact, they trained the kids from high school how to create this content. And so the kids in high school learned. There was a BBC report I heard where one of them was interviewed, and he said, "Yeah, Hillary really wanted Trump to win. That was mine. That was the best. That was the most lucrative. I bought a Mercedes with that, and that is the art. And we teach these kids the art. These, can you blame them? They don't know. They don't care who wins the election. They have been given a system, the Google ad system, which has been training them like giving dog treats. And they find if they put fake stuff on, they get more treats. And so that's how they get their income. So
Facebook's response to the problem of fake news, though, was to downgrade all news. And so they tweaked their algorithm, 9 months ago or so. And so suddenly, the New York Times doesn't show up as much as, your friend's cat photo. And, so they've kind of dumbed down Facebook, which does mean that fake news doesn't go as viral, but
they decided to put in in less national news, I gather. So,
well, they prioritized sharing friends to friends rather than information from news sources.
Well, and of course that's how it started out. Facebook was people chatting, friends talking, and.
But is that is that the answer? Is that do we deal with sort of the problem of fake news by trying to
going back to the the AdWords campaign? So I think I've heard people in Google suggest that there may be ways in which they can just change the ad system. So that, for example, when you followed there is a button you can press when you've really are frustrated by the clickbait. When you, for example, you followed an ad which says where the link text says one thing, and you followed an ad and it takes you to something completely different. There should be an I protest button, and then that could allow the ad system to flag it, and then if you had lots of hundreds of thousands of people employed by the ad system or AI systems or what have you, looking at that, then you could reduce the rewards that go to people with clickbait or fake links. And so then by tweaking the system, maybe you could just really eliminate that sort of badness on the net by tweaking the algorithms. I think it is interesting to look at algorithms. I think it doesn't remove the underlying fundamental core, really horrible, difficult end question as to what you allow and what you don't allow. But tweaking algorithms, I could imagine, could lead to a more friendly world.
I'm going to come to the audience in a second, so think of any question you might have. But the one last topic I wanted to address first is sort of the global nature of the internet and the challenges that pose when we have different standards in different parts of the world. So, when you have some, quack cleric in Florida who burns a Quran, which is protected speech in the United States, that sets off riots in Pakistan. How do we address that? Should we all be guided by the sensibilities of the most sensitive place?
I think human rights are universal rights, right? Mm-hmm. So how have we been guiding ourselves all this time when we look at women's rights, or when we look at we've kind of learned along the way that beating a woman is not right. So just like the way we've taught ourselves that global platform of the rights, what you should be allowed to do and what you shouldn't be allowed to do, I think that's just the way we're going to have to make the rules as we go along, because I don't think that there'll be a uniform set that everyone is going to follow all at once. But if we can have a baseline kind of thing that this is what would be acceptable, then countries will rise to that occasion as they mature.
Okay, I mean, I was going to talk about something else that precedes what you...
Okay, go ahead, Matthew.
Which is that I think, aside from having severe problems with the business model, organizations like Facebook also have this kind of a frozen identity crisis, where they refuse to self-identify as liberal democratic organizations. They depend for their business entirely on the existence of liberal democracy. I mean, as companies, they are a product of liberal democracy. Yet they don't identify as such. And so when Russia spends hundreds of millions or tens of millions on promoting disinformation on Facebook, they say, well, hands off. The internet is flat. There's no room for political ideology. But yes, there is. If the enemies of liberal democracy, like Russia, are using the tools which you have created to attack liberal democracy itself, then, I mean, you have to do something about it.
But
you can't just keep your hands off.
I mean, I think Facebook, in terms of the idea of, Russia or others manipulating elections, they're now actively on that. So
it's taken a while, and it's too late now.
Well, it's too late for Trump, et cetera. But for example, with the European parliamentary elections coming up, they're super sensitive to this. But there's a separate issue, which is, domestic political speech. What do you do if the head of state is demonizing, is spouting hate speech? What do you do with Viktor Orban? So here he is, the prime minister but he is demonizing migrants, spreading lies about refugees, spreading intolerance. Who is Facebook to say, no, those are not our values, but at the same time, these are antithetical to the liberal democracy that you rightly highlight that Facebook is a product of.
Well,
I'm with you on
go
this.
ahead.
I think that particularly when it comes to truth, yes, when it comes to the liberal democratic values, I think it's reasonable for Facebook to defend democracy and truth. And I think that when the current president was elected, the media sort of went through, but they blogged to a certain extent about the shock they went through because they had to they had to realize that they had to focus on what is true, and not necessarily give some people, just because they occupy certain positions, assume that everything that they said should be repeated or respected. So that's that they had to ask that question that you just asked about, and I think the American press had to come down. Most of it came down saying, no, actually we have to stick with the truth. And for some of them, it seems that they've managed to keep trying to say we report the truth, and so some of the others they seem to end up just battling the administration, because the administration seemed then pushed back against them, and that became a battle, or just a mudslinging match.
If the truth is your guide, do you want should Facebook be censoring, or should Twitter be censoring Trump tweets?
Yes, the question
because
is,
they're false.
Does Donald Trump respect Twitter's user agreement?
No, and should they? Here he is president of the United States. Is this, should they just say, okay, this is political speech. This is, deserves the highest respect of free expression. Therefore, we're just going to let it go. Or should they apply truth standards, fact-finding, to the president of the United States tweets?
And block him.
Do they have the moral courage, really, is the question. Does Twitter have the moral courage to censor the president of the United States?
Well, and who is Twitter to do that?
Well, it's a platform where messages are being sent to hundreds of millions of people, a lot of times, the majority of times, which are lies and known lies. So if you are disseminating lies, do you have the moral courage of taking down the tweets that are lies? Maybe you don't censor, you don't disable his account, but you realize that, okay, this is a lie, you need to take it off, and we will delete this tweet.
It's a violation of our terms of service.
Absolutely.
What would you, Patrick, Matthew, what would you think about?
Well, you are raising up the big scary question of the social media, are they a new vehicle, a new tool that maybe has allowed or will allow, has allowed, I will not quote specific countries, autocrats to come to power, enabling them to go around the institutions, the political parties, the media, all the, again, mediators and institutions that we had, and talk directly to the people and to raise an army, basically. And are they the poison of our democracies? That's the real question.
With the case of Viktor Orban, I was going to say that it's up to civil society to fight back, but the problem is you're fighting back against a government that has an unlimited budget to spend on these kinds of online campaigns.
Hopefully subsidized by the EU.
Yes.
All right, let me open it up. Any questions from the audience, comments?
Maybe you have solutions.
Yes, the easy part, yes.
That'll be better.
Yes, go ahead. I made a microphone over here.
I just wanted to say, I think what's happening is it's really hard, I think, for people to go out into the ring today, because it's so much easier to throw rocks at them. And I'm worried that this younger generation will be afraid to do great things. If I thought my daughter was going to have death threats against her, I'm not sure I would encourage her to do tough things. I also wanted to say, I think this isn't really a solution, but something that I see is that we as people now are saying, I had my social time today, I was on social media. But I think what we're really dangerously losing in society are places where we come together, places of belonging. You know, we used to go to church, and now faith has kind of lost that grasp, and it's like, that's when we really can learn to see each other and be together with our neighbors and learn to hold our differences tenderly. And we need to be in front of people. And I think that we're not in front of people enough, which is why this polarization is happening.
Yeah. There is something dehumanizing about social media. And the humanization of the other does make us behave better. Yeah. And when you see this real person in front of you as opposed to a blob.
I agree with you in the way that I think technology has made us all kids, clueless, tempered kids. And we need to grow up as societies. We need to grow up from that. And just emotional kids. And we haven't had time to deal with those technology as societies. And we need to, I think, again, on the platform side, we need to expand the space of curation. And on the user side, we need to expand the space of dialogue. And maybe we need to learn to, not to be always, not to react to everything. Because basically to take cartoons, any political cartoon will hurt someone. And people get hurt more and more. People are very sensitive more and more. We need to grow up from that and maybe make the case for indifference. If not tolerance, indifference. Something shocks you, just let it go, let it pass.
So the other night I was listening to Jimmy Wales talk about his experience of building Wikipedia. One of the things he said was that made it such a rich one for him was that all the people who came and collaborated with were all nice. They were all friendly, they were collaborative, they worked together, and the systems he built allowed them to create categories of people and categories of topics, and they produced to a certain extent more and more formalized processes for dealing with disagreement. But when they did disagreement, it was all done in a very civilized fashion. All the discussion would be taken to a discussion page, and you could appeal to the admin. And if the admin was evil, then you could all vote within the group to have the admin removed from being an admin and vote for other admins. So in fact, the Wikipedia thing is Wikipedia is a space where the people are nice. Wikipedia is a space where they work together and are constructive. Wikipedia is a space where they produce truth, and in fact they have produced this incredible, very valuable thing. So when you talk about technology, some technology, I can imagine that it really depends how you put together the technology and also how you prime and lead the communities within it. But there is one place. It's just like if you are unhappy one day, go to the maternity department in your local hospital where babies are being born. It's always lovely there. And so when you go to one of the discussions on Wikipedia when you're feeling depressed about the way the world works, so there is good out there, and that good was constructed and is maintained and curated, and the culture there is maintained and curated carefully by people who cherish it and have used it to achieve huge constructive advances. So all is not lost, and maybe we can use...
You're describing 95% of Wikipedia. But if you go to a Wikipedia page where there is political passion, go to the Israel page, go to the Trump page, and people, these pages are frozen, because if they were not frozen, people would be editing them every second, and it would be back and forth, and which is where it's those issues, it's that 5% or 2% or whatever it is, that is what infects social media, because those same points of passion explode on social media. There's no nice little mediating group there, or should there be? I mean, is there something we can learn from Wikipedia?
Just putting out there are systems out there, and there are nice people and effective systems. Yes, they don't solve all the problems. They don't.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Many of you mentioned the fact that Facebook is anchored in a liberal democracy and should act as such and make those values respected, and but doesn't that imply the danger that if you restrict or regulate or certify or too much Facebook, there'll be the emergence of other platforms? Because in the first place, Facebook emerged as an outlet from the media, which restricted much of the free speech, and the web and Facebook in particular became an outlet. So there will be outlets to this regulated outlet. So that's one danger. Second, I didn't hear on this panel any mention of justice. I mean, the Article 19 of the Chart of Human Rights, and the fact that there is a body of jurisprudence that you are supposed to limit hate speech to the extent of its that you really found it is under the definition of hate speech, but you're supposed to allow much of offending speech as long as it still doesn't fall under the definition of hate speech. So imagine how the fathers of the human rights were liberal in their views of freedom of speech, and this is rather threatened nowadays. So let us begin by having regulators that would be multilateral, not just from one country with their ideological biases, but multilateral cyber regulator. Because the problem, what happened to you, madam, maybe the justice is too slow to intervene in cases of cyber harassment. There is actions that are taken, there are things that happen, and the justice is so slow that it should be a justice that is really set on the same rhythm, the same timing as the internet. And this is totally lacking. What is missing is the justice that is able to intervene in the right timing. Okay. What do you see?
Yeah, well, you raised two important issues. I mean, one is, where is competition, antitrust law? How is it that Facebook owns Instagram and WhatsApp, and just kind of buys up the competition? And then second, with hate speech, I mean, Sharmeen, you may want to talk about this. I mean, I think when I think about a hate speech law gone awry, I think about Pakistan's blasphemy laws, which are basically hate speech laws. And you may want to describe a little bit how they play out in reality.
This session is being live streamed around the world.
Okay, so we won't go there. All right.
My words very carefully. When you don't have, any kind of laws in which you can accuse people of something without any proof and send them to jail just because of your word against someone else, there's an inherent problem right there and then. And there are many laws like that, one particular in my country, and you don't need proof. You can just accuse someone and that person will be sent to jail, and then you can fight for years, and if that person is let out, he'll probably or she'll probably get shot. So yes, that is, but and many of us actually that speak up and speak out live in fear that someone will accuse us under that law and we will be unable to do something. Picking up from just one thing, before if you went out and kind of had hate speech, who would you be propagating? What would be the kind of amplification method you would be using? You'd go on television, you'd go on the radio, someone would write an article about you. You wouldn't instantly live be reaching the entire globe, which you can do now. That's the central kind of issue right there and then. The amplification is just nuts.
Yeah.
You could on TV. And people use radio. So
3-second delay would cut that off.
Well, it didn't when the Rwandan genocide, I gather, was spread very much by people taking over the radio station, and so there are other media which have pretty wide broadcast.
So the question of hate speech is tricky enough when it comes to humor. Any cartoon could be seen as hate speech by some. So the very easy answer is the legal frame, because of course you have freedom of speech is limited by a legal frame very often, and hate speech, if it's encouraging specifically to kill someone, that comes under under the law. But then legal frames, that's easy enough. They're bound by the nations, and actually France has laws that are more stringent. La loi sur la presse limits much more the freedom to insult than the US, which has no limitations basically on freedom of speech. But then when it comes to, and you alluded to that, to the global scene, what do? When something you do that is meant for one audience and is being seen all over the world, and that's back to the Danish cartoons controversy, which was a big case in point of that huge issue. And it led, again, to, I mean, cartoons almost led to World War III back then. Demonstrations, people got killed. Because, and I think there is no real answer to that. We will not find a sense of humor common to all of us on this planet. Cartoons were in the middle of that debate because if humor is cultural, an image is universal. So there is a contradiction there. And so we are in for big misunderstandings. And I don't see any clear solution to that. We have to live with that because we, as democratic societies, we need humor as much as the air that we breathe. So we need to live with that or get killed for that.
But I don't think
let me just go to the audience being international. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. First, a comment. It's quite interesting when you look around the room and you find the composition of the audience is the inverse of the composition of the panel in terms of gender.
Yes.
And I just wonder what that means, but it's maybe a question for another day. As somebody who was just an ordinary global international executive who spoke out and got some threats, not necessarily coming through the internet, not necessarily coming through Facebook, not necessarily coming through anything. I just wonder, one of the solutions is not just to look at the social media. Yes, there is amplification, and this is massive. There are a number of things. One is education on how to use such things. Two is some sort of, maybe legislation is the wrong thing, but certainly you could put filters in for the more extreme sorts that you talked about of threats and violence and sexual harassment. This should not be too difficult to do. So for me, the third thing as well is there a lot, you don't have to look very far to find media and all sorts of media, not just social media, that cause polarization against politicians or against ordinary people or against ordinary organizations. And maybe they have to look at themselves and decide what is really freedom of speech and what is manipulation of people. And I think this is something that adds into what you've all been talking about.
Do we trust?
You want me to leave now?
No.
no, you're a token male in the audience.
Yes.
Don't go.
No, but I mean, if Facebook were to try to apply a standard between, legitimate argument versus manipulation, would they get any place with that? Or is that in the eye of the beholder?
Well, a lot of the manipulation that's on Facebook is done in targeted advertising, and I've suggested that they should not allow political ads. If you're a political organization, that you should be able to advertise on Facebook, but your ads should go random to everybody.
Yeah, no, that's one of the solutions being offered is that no black ads for politics. And we may well need different rules for electoral campaigns. No foreign funding, no black ads, anything published, anything used has got to be published.
A black ad?
A black ad, in other words, I mean, if I understand correctly, under Facebook, you could say, this is the demographic I want to reach. Here's the ad. The only people who see it are the ones who, got it in their feed, but it's otherwise unavailable to the public. And one possible solution would be to say any political ad has to be available to the public as a way of just...
Or even better, deliver to everybody. In Britain, you're not allowed to advertise on TV.
Well, this would be, delivering to everybody with
if you're a political party. That's where I, from when I was a kid, those were the rules because people advertising on TV was too manipulative and was only available to people with money.
All right, I think I see our time is running out, but I think what we've seen here is, one, there is a real problem, one that, can go all the way to violence and murder, but can lead to very serious harassment and manipulation of the electoral system. There, is grappling with this problem. I mean, I think the platforms are much further along today than they were 2 years ago, just at the point of Trump's electoral victory. But I think you've seen just through the discussion today that the answers are not easy, and that there are very different points of view around anonymity or not, around the role of the platforms versus government versus some other more executive or independent body. And this is a very important issue to figure out. It's good that we're having this discussion, but I think we're all grappling with what the right answers are. And there probably isn't going to be a single right answer. There's going to be a period of experimentation where hopefully we find something in the course of that works. So thank you for joining us, and I hope we can continue the discussion.
Thank you.